What happens when a combat movie stops trying to impress you and starts trying to tell the truth? Most films smooth the edges, simplify the chaos, and turn history into something comfortable. But a rare few do the opposite. They lean into confusion, exhaustion, and uncomfortable accuracy. Halfway through watching them, you stop feeling entertained and start feeling present. And by the end, you realize something unsettling. These stories were not polished. They were remembered, and historians noticed. Number 12. The Longest Day, 1962. Before modern combat films chased intensity, this one chased records. The Longest Day was never designed to be flashy. It was built to be correct. Producer Daryl F. Zanuck didn't want legend. He wanted documentation. That obsession shaped every decision. The film was shot on the actual Normandy coastline, using real terrain, real structures, and military plans pulled directly from Allied archives. Nothing was guessed. Everything was checked. What truly set it apart was who stood behind the camera. Dozens of veterans from the invasion were hired as advisors, not to polish scenes, but to stop them when something felt wrong. If a movement looked staged, it was redone. If a uniform detail felt off, it was corrected. The cast included major stars, but they were often placed beside real service members who had been there. That contrast was intentional. The goal was memory, not performance. The film also took an unusual approach to perspective. Instead of following one hero, it jumped between viewpoints, reflecting how the event actually unfolded. Disconnected, fragmented, overwhelming. Historians praise this choice because it mirrored how no single participant ever saw the whole picture. When former military leaders reviewed the film, many described it less as a movie and more as a visual archive. That reputation stuck. Decades later, it's still referenced in classrooms not because it feels dramatic, but because it feels dependable. That is not cinematic glory. That is trust earned the hard way. Number 11. Saving Private Ryan, 1998. This film didn't ease audiences into history. It dropped them into it without warning. When Saving Private Ryan opened, viewers weren't watching a scene. They were reacting, hands clenched, breathing slowed. Some couldn't finish the first section. That response was not accidental. Director Steven Spielberg rebuilt the experience from the ground up using first-hand accounts, not film tradition. The opening sequence was designed around confusion. Cameras stayed low, colors were drained, sound faded in and out. These choices were based on descriptions from veterans who struggled to explain what they remembered. Not clarity, sensation. The actors went through an intense preparation period that stripped away performance habits. They learned to move awkwardly, to hesitate, to make mistakes. Even small details were treated seriously. The terrain texture matched historical records. The pacing of movement reflected how real units advanced under pressure. Medics were shown working with urgency, not elegance. Historians later pointed out that many of these moments matched training manuals and battlefield reports almost frame for frame. But what truly shocked scholars was the tone. The film refused to frame events as clean or heroic. There was no swelling relief, no triumphant pause, just momentum and cost. Many historians described it as the closest approximation of lived memory ever put on screen. It changed expectations overnight. After this, accuracy was no longer optional. It was the new standard. Number 10. Black Hawk Down, 2001. This film feels relentless for a reason. Black Hawk Down was built using timelines, transcripts, and after-action reports. Director Ridley Scott treated the story like a reconstruction, not an adaptation. The goal was to show how fast order dissolves when plans collide with reality. The city environment was recreated using satellite imagery and ground-level references. Layouts matched actual streets. Timing followed documented sequences. Even the dialogue reflected real communication patterns pulled from recorded exchanges. Actors trained alongside people who had lived the event, learning how exhaustion affects posture, speech, and decision-making. Historians praise the film's refusal to simplify. Confusion was not cleaned up in editing. Overlapping instructions were left intact. Moments where nothing made sense were allowed to stay that way. That honesty stood out. It reflected how real operations feel from the inside. What surprised experts most was the attention to atmosphere. Dust affected visibility. Noise overwhelmed communication. Fatigue altered judgment. These weren't cinematic effects. They were deliberate recreations of conditions described in reports. The result was a film that many military historians later used as an example of modern conflict realism. Not because it explained everything, but because it showed how little control participants actually had. That perspective mattered. Number 9. We Were Soldiers, 2002. This story came with something rare. The people who lived it were still there to correct it. We Were Soldiers was developed alongside Lieutenant General Hal Moore, whose first-hand involvement shaped every scene. Nothing moved forward without verification. The terrain was reconstructed using aerial images and battlefield sketches. Movements followed tactical maps used during the original operation. Dialogue was often lifted directly from recorded transmissions. Even the way units spread out and regrouped was designed to reflect early helicopter-based conflict, something rarely portrayed accurately. What historians appreciated most was the balance. The film didn't exaggerate confusion or discipline. It showed both. Moments of control existed, alongside moments of collapse. That duality matched historical analysis of the engagement. Uniforms, behavior, and timing all reflected documented reality. But beyond visuals, the emotional pacing mattered. Fear didn't spike and vanish. It lingered. Exhaustion built gradually. Decisions carried weight. When the finished film was screened privately, Moore reportedly said it matched his memory more closely than he expected. That endorsement mattered. Scholars later cited the film as one of the most responsible portrayals of early conflict escalation. It didn't rewrite history. It respected it. Number 8. Letters from Iwo Jima, 2006. This film stood out by doing something rare. It told the story from the other side without turning it into spectacle. Directed by Clint Eastwood, Letters from Iwo Jima was built using translated letters, diaries, and military records. Every scene began with research, not assumption. The sets were reconstructed using historical photos and battlefield surveys. Bunker layouts matched known designs. Terrain elevation followed real maps. Language was carefully controlled to reflect period speech without exaggeration. Historians praised the restraint. What made the film impactful was its focus on routine, waiting, digging, writing, small moments that rarely make it into combat cinema. Scholars noted that this attention to daily life aligned closely with surviving accounts. There was no rush to dramatize. Silence was allowed. Hesitation was visible. These choices created a sense of authenticity that surprised experts. Many described it as emotionally accurate, not just visually correct. By avoiding caricature and focusing on personal perspective, the film expanded how historical conflict could be portrayed responsibly. It reminded audiences that accuracy is not about sides. It's about listening, and historians noticed that immediately. Number 7. 1917, 2019. This film doesn't feel like a story being told. It feels like time refusing to pause. 1917 was inspired by stories passed down through the director's family, and that personal connection shaped everything. Instead of cutting between scenes, the film follows a single mission almost without interruption. That choice wasn't a trick, it was a commitment to realism. Historians were immediately drawn to how accurately it captured movement through World War I terrain. Trench layouts matched period maps. Distances between positions reflected real military planning. Even the pace of walking felt right. Slow when cautious, rushed only when panic forced it. The lighting was equally deliberate. Scenes were filmed using natural daylight patterns based on seasonal records. Night sequences reflected how limited visibility truly was before modern illumination. Historians praise this detail because it shaped decision-making exactly as it did in real conditions. What stood out most was behavior. Characters hesitate. They misjudge distances. They freeze briefly when overwhelmed. These small moments were drawn from soldier diaries and training manuals. Nothing felt heroic. Everything felt human. By refusing to give the audience relief through edits or dramatic pauses, the film recreated fatigue in real time. Scholars later described it as one of the most physically honest portrayals of a single assignment ever put on screen. It didn't explain the past. It walked you through it, step by step. Number 6, Hacksaw Ridge, 2016. This story sounds impossible until you realize how closely the film followed the record. Hacksaw Ridge focused on battlefield support work during the Battle of Okinawa, and historians immediately noticed the care taken with detail. The environment was reconstructed using maps, survivor interviews, and original terrain measurements. The steep cliff face was rebuilt to scale. Mud depth was tested repeatedly. Weather conditions were simulated to reflect historical accounts. These choices mattered because they shaped how people moved. Nothing looked effortless because nothing was meant to be. Historians were particularly impressed by the accuracy of field medical scenes. The techniques shown matched documented practices from the era. The pacing reflected real urgency, no shortcuts, no dramatic pauses, just repetition under pressure. The film also avoided exaggeration. Exhaustion built slowly. Mistakes happened quietly. The weight of constant effort became the focus. Scholars praise this restraint, noting that many films rush emotional impact instead of letting it accumulate. By filming many scenes in sequence, the lead performer's fatigue became real. That authenticity translated on screen. Veterans who later commented on the film often focused on how familiar the physical strain felt. Hacksaw Ridge earned its reputation not through spectacle, but through persistence. It showed that realism isn't loud. Sometimes it's just relentless. Number 5, Lone Survivor, 2013. This film doesn't ease into its intensity. It builds pressure through accuracy. Lone Survivor was developed alongside the individual whose account it follows, and that direct involvement shaped everything from pacing to posture. Nothing was left to guesswork. The terrain was carefully selected to match real elevation and surface conditions. Movement sequences reflected how bodies respond to uneven ground over long periods. Historians noted how falls, recoveries, and exhaustion mirrored real accounts rather than cinematic choreography. Sound design also stood out. Echoes behaved naturally. Silence lingered longer than expected. These choices were based on recordings taken in similar environments. Scholars praise this because sound plays a major role in perception under stress. The film avoided simplifying communication. Confusion was layered, messages overlapped. Timing. Errors mattered. Historians often point to this as one of the film's strongest elements. It reflected how plans unravel without clear villains or dramatic twists. Rather than focusing on outcome, the film emphasized endurance. That approach aligned closely with the after-action reports, which often stress survival over strategy. Many experts described Lone Survivor as uncomfortable but necessary. It didn't shape memory, it challenged it. That is why it continues to be referenced in discussions about modern realism. Number 4. Das Boot, 1981. Few films have earned as much respect from historians as Das Boot. This wasn't just accuracy, it was immersion. The production team built a full-scale interior set that moved and shifted, forcing performers to navigate cramped conditions exactly as described in historical records. Consultants included people who had lived the experience. Their input shaped everything from body language to emotional pacing. The film avoided dramatic music cues. Instead, tension came from routine, waiting, listening, reacting to subtle changes. Historians praise the portrayal of fatigue. Days blurred together. Small problems became overwhelming. The environment felt closed in. These details aligned closely with personal logs kept during long patrols. Language use was another strength. Dialogue reflected period speech without dramatization. Orders were brief. Conversations were functional. Silence carried weight. Rather than focusing on triumph, the film focused on strain. Scholars often cite this as the reason it feels timeless. It didn't try to impress. It tried to endure. Decades later, Das Boot is still used as a reference point. Not because it explains strategy, but because it captures atmosphere with unsettling precision. Number 3. Come and See, 1985. This film doesn't guide you, it confronts you. Come and See was built around first-hand accounts and regional history, and historians were struck by how little it softened. The setting was recreated using real locations affected by the events depicted. Nothing was stylized. The lead performance was shaped by gradual exposure to stress rather than dramatic shifts. Historians noted how this mirrored documented psychological responses. Confusion didn't arrive all at once, it crept in. The camera often lingered longer than comfortable. That choice reflected how events were experienced, not remembered. Scholars praise this because memory often distorts intensity, while presence does not. There was no rush to explain context. The film trusted the audience to observe. That approach aligned with historical testimony, which often lacks clear structure or resolution. What made the film shocking to experts was its honesty. It didn't aim for balance, it aimed for truth, as remembered by those who endured it. Many historians later described it as one of the most emotionally accurate portrayals ever produced. Not because it documented facts, but because it respected experience. Number 2. The Outpost, 2020. This film doesn't feel like a movie. It feels like a report brought to life. The Outpost was built almost entirely from official records, first-hand interviews, and detailed timelines. Director Rod Lurie approached the project with the mindset of reconstruction, not entertainment. Every moment had to line up with what actually happened. The location was recreated using satellite imagery and terrain studies. Elevation mattered, sightlines mattered. Even the placement of structures followed archive diagrams. Historians immediately noticed this because geography shaped every decision during the real event. Dialogue was another standout. Many lines came directly from recorded communications. Conversations overlap. Instructions interrupt each other. That confusion wasn't cleaned up, it was preserved. Experts praise this choice because it mirrored how information actually flows under pressure. What shocked historians most was the pacing. There were no artificial breaks, no dramatic slowdowns. Events escalated exactly as documented, minute by minute. Exhaustion appeared naturally. Decision-making became strained. Small delays carried massive consequences. The film also avoided exaggeration. No single moment was framed as heroic spectacle. Instead, the focus stayed on coordination, strain, and persistence. Historians later described it as one of the most accurate modern conflict portrayals ever produced. When the film ends, there's no release, just silence. That reaction told experts everything they needed to know. Accuracy doesn't always leave room for applause. Number 1. Band of Brothers, 2001. This isn't just accurate, it's verified. Band of Brothers earned its reputation the hard way. Every episode was built using interviews, letters, unit records, and battlefield maps. Survivors were involved directly. If something felt wrong, it was changed. Training was intense. Performers lived together, learned routines, and adopted habits described by the real individuals they portrayed. Historians noticed how this translated on screen. Movement felt natural, reactions felt earned. Nothing looked rehearsed. The series paid close attention to progression. Fatigue built over time. Confidence shifted. Humor faded. These changes mirrored real accounts, which historians praised for their honesty. The story didn't reset each episode. It carried weight forward. Even quiet scenes mattered. Waiting, walking, sitting in silence. These moments reflected how most time was actually spent. Experts often point to this restraint as the reason the series feels authentic rather than dramatic. Perhaps most importantly, the series never tried to simplify memory. Different perspectives were allowed to coexist. Confusion was left unresolved. Loss wasn't tied up neatly. Historians frequently describe Band of Brothers as the closest screen representation of lived experience ever produced. Not because it explained everything, but because it respected complexity. That's why it still stands at the top. So, what separates a regular combat film from one that makes historians pause? It's not scale, it's not spectacle. It's respect for detail, memory, and uncertainty. These films didn't try to clean up history. They let it stay rough around the edges. And that honesty lingers long after the screen fades. Which one stayed with you the longest? Drop your thoughts below. Share this with someone who loves real stories. And subscribe for more deep dives where accuracy matters more than comfort. History doesn't whisper. Sometimes it stares back.